Hey, if you want to know where Parker has been lately, stick around at the end of the video.
Welcome, foolish mortals.
Almost everyone knows that the Haunted Mansion was not one of Disneyland's opening day attractions. In fact, the ride was open more than 10 years after the opening of the park. So it's surprising to know that the Haunted Mansion was one of Walt's first planned rides. Actually, Walt began planning this attraction 20 years before the park's opening. To know why, we need to go back to the days where Disneyland was not being planned yet, but an idea for an amusement park called Mickey Mouse Park was being created. Mickey Mouse Park was designed to be a small, family-friendly park located at Disney's Burbank Animation Studios. This park was never built, of course, but many of the ideas and plans for it had a huge influence on the design for Disneyland. One of these ideas was
The Haunted Mansion.
Back then, the attraction was called Church, Graveyard, and Haunted House, and it was supposed to celebrate the classic haunted house attractions that already existed in amusement parks throughout the world. The idea was that every small town had its city hall, its drugstore, etc., and they also had a house at the end of the street or up a hill that everyone thought was haunted. So, they were going to create a small town with a path at the end of Main Street that would take guests through a church, a graveyard, and finally, to an old house on the hill. The original haunted house attraction was envisioned as a walkthrough attraction, in which guests would see various haunted scenes throughout the house. But again, this park was never built, and when Disneyland was being planned, the haunted house project was put on hold, even though Walt still had this attraction in mind. Disneyland opened in 1955, and there was no haunted house on site. Walt was postponing it until the park's expansion, and 2 years later, he was ready for this expansion. So he went straight to Ken Anderson's desk, tapped him on the shoulder, and asked him to start working on the ride. As we said earlier, when the Haunted Mansion was first thought of, it was supposed to be at the end of Main Street. This didn't work out in Disneyland, so it was moved to Frontierland. But while Ken Anderson continued working on the ride, Walt thought of a new land for Disneyland, New Orleans Square. He thought that New Orleans Square would be the perfect place for an old southern abandoned mansion at the end of the bayou. So, using a catalog of Victorian decorative art and architecture for inspiration for the outside of the manor, Ken created the initial designs of what would later become the Haunted Mansion's facade. Ken was also in charge of coming up with the story and the experience inside of the walk-through attraction, and he was greatly influenced by his experiences at the Winchester Mystery House in San Jose. He visited the Winchester Mystery House to take notes of everything, from the size of the tour group to the time it took to complete the tour, so he could have a better idea on how to keep the crowds flowing inside the mansion. He also believed that a strong story for the mansion was very important because, first of all, storytelling was one of the elements that had made Disneyland's dark rides different from other amusement park dark rides. And not only that, but a story was also necessary so guests would move in order through the ride rather than stay in one place and clog up the flow of traffic. He came up with 4 different stories for the mansion. The first of these stories was created so that the Haunted Mansion could be somewhat linked to the Pirates of the Caribbean Museum that was also being planned for New Orleans Square.
Jean Lafitte.
What?
I said Jean Lafitte.
Who said that?
I did. It's me, Offhand Disney.
Hey! Offhand Disney, what are you doing here?
I heard you were talking about the link between pirates and the Haunted Mansion and came out to talk about, of course, Jean Lafitte.
Oh, okay, that's a pretty cool theory and all, but we're talking about 1957 to 58. That theory didn't exist at all that time.
Oh.
But why don't you help me out and tell me the 4 stories that Ken Anderson came up with?
Sure. Well, you see, the first story, as you mentioned, was supposed to tie pirates in with the mansion. The mansion was the seaside manor of an old sea captain. He met and married a young woman named Priscilla, and on their wedding day, he warned her not to enter the attic. The bride decides not to pay attention to this warning and goes right to the attic where she discovers that he is actually a notorious pirate. Captain Gore finds out, and scared that his wife will tell everybody his secret, he tossed her out of the window, and of course this kills her. The bride came back as a ghost and haunted the pirate until he took his own life by hanging himself. The second story talked about was the Bloodmere Manor, which was the estate of the Blood family, appropriately named. It was built around 1800 in a bayou near New Orleans and then was moved to Disneyland to be restored and shown as an example of New Orleans' early architecture. But of course, as soon as it arrived at Disneyland, some strange stuff started to happen. The restoration work of each day was destroyed during the night, and the night watchman reported that he heard creepy screams and saw weird lights. And there has even been a disappearance of one of the carpenters working on the mansion's restoration. Because of this, an investigation was done where it was discovered that the house had a tragic and bloody history of unlucky owners who died sudden and violent deaths. So, of course, their unhappy ghosts remained behind to haunt anybody that tried to come near their house, and warned any foolish mortals that dared enter to go home. And then it was decided that the two attractions didn't really have to be tied together, so Anderson thought of having a ride that featured Ichabod Crane's encounter with the Headless Horseman. This would basically just be a retelling of Disney's animated classic, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, with some scenes from Night on Bald Mountain from Fantasia, which, by the way, is my favorite segment of that film. The last story brought forward the ghosts from the Lonesome Ghosts cartoon. You see, Walt had an idea that there would be a wedding in the house, and the lonesome ghosts would guide you at certain points. They even talked at one point about having Dracula, Frankenstein, and many other monsters in attendance at the wedding. And those were the 4 story concepts that Ken Anderson came up with. Back to you, Will.
Thanks, Offhand Disney. So, Ken Anderson showed Walt his plans for the Haunted Mansion, and he didn't like them. The reason behind this was that Walt wasn't fond of the idea of having an old, decaying, and run-down buildings inside his park. So he turned them down by saying that they would take care of the outside of the house, and the ghosts would take care of the inside. Ken Anderson worked for 2 years on this project, and then, in 1958, he stopped so he could go and work on the Sleeping Beauty film. And as soon as he stepped out, Rolly Crump and Yale Gracie stepped in. They began working on the ride's special effects and some of the proposed scenes. Still, at the beginning of 1959, Walt felt that the project wasn't moving in the right direction. He wasn't sold on the idea of doing a walk-through attraction at all now, and to make matters worse, the manor's appearance had not been addressed, and he was still not happy with the look of it. So, the project was put on hold once more. But the marketing team did not receive the message, and that's why the Haunted Mansion started appearing on official Disneyland maps a decade before the construction of the ride had even began. In spite of the hold, the Imagineers didn't give up, and by the early 1960s, the issue of the outside design of the manor was solved. It was decided that one of Ken Anderson's designs would be used, but with a nicer, cleaner look. The mansion's opening was planned for 1963, and so, construction on the building started on 1961, even though Imagineers had no idea what would be inside the mansion yet. They would figure it out before the construction of the building was done, and maybe they would have, if Walt's attention hadn't gone elsewhere. Hey Parker, where have you been?
Hey Will. Well, I've been busy creating my own at-home haunted mansion because I'm a dog and I can't go to Disneyland myself. My friends at Ye Old Prop Shop have some awesome designs that make you feel like you're in the mansion yourself. Like this foolish mortal one they sent me, or this servants quarters only sign. They've even got some personalized ones, so be sure to check out their store.
Great, I'll do that. Well, that's it for today. But be sure to come back next week for part 2 of the video. We would like to thank Offhand Disney for being with us for this video. And also thank our patrons and leave a link so you can check out our rewards. Here's last week's giveaway winner. Congratulations, Adam Ferry. And be sure to comment with the hashtag Haunted Mansion giveaway for a chance to win this week's t-shirt.